Good evening. I'm Tim O'Shea. I'm the principal of the university. A tremendous pleasure to welcome you to this event to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Charles Darwin's birth. The University of Edinburgh is very proud of its connection with a lot of very distinguished scientists over the last 400 plus years. But we do take a particular pride in our connection with Charles Darwin, and very emotionally satisfying to pass the plaque on the house where he stayed when he was a student here. We've got a very strong panel of distinguished experts to talk to you. And can I say how really pleased I am that you've chose to come out on this cold, wet night to participate in this important celebratory event, and how particularly pleased I am that we have such strong representation from the schools. So our panel tonight is being chaired by Professor Aubrey Manning, a very distinguished expert in animal behaviour, and he is joined by Professor Stuart Monroe, Dr. John Henry, Dr. Stannah Ditch, and Professor Mary Bounds, and the more detailed introductions will be done by Professor Manning.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Principal. I'm delighted to chair this meeting this evening, and it seems to me this is a splendid event. I'm quite sure that, as you will realise, there are events like this going on all over the world today. Certainly I can think of two in the immediate, closely by anyway. In London there's a huge party in the Natural History Museum. They've moved Darwin's statue down from a gallery down to the top of the stairs. He's sitting there in his white marble beauty, looking down on a great party. And in Shrewsbury this afternoon there was a huge cake baked with 200 candles for their illustrious son, and everybody, I'm sure, was singing happy birthday to Darwin there. So we're in very good company. Now, I wonder if any of you, know what I learnt this afternoon, to my great surprise and delight. It's also the 200th birthday of Abraham Lincoln. And it occurred to me that that was a pretty good day for the planet, really. We didn't do too badly. And, of course, we know that evolutionary ideas were around long before Darwin. You can trace some of them back to the Greeks. But that's not really what we're celebrating. Darwin is rightly called the parent of evolution through natural selection, because he it was who meticulously gathered the information, helped by many others, Alfred Russel Wallace in particular, but he came up with a mechanism and he hammered home the ideas with enormous body of facts. He was a polymath as a biologist. But anyway, as the principal said, we can claim a certain part of distinction here in Edinburgh. He was here from October 1825 till April 1827 as a very young man, 15, 16 years old. But he got in touch with, he was taken under the wing of various biologists. John Henry is going to be speaking about that, but I just wanted to show you one picture, which is this of the minute book of the Plinian Society, which was a society founded by the professor of natural history then, at which students and other worthies presented scientific material. This is the very first record of a scientific contribution by Charles Darwin, March the 27th, 1827. And it begins at the top. Mr. Darwin communicated to the Society two discoveries which he had made. They were concerning creatures on the Firth of Forth, and one is about the motile eggs of a sea mat, an encrusting animal. That's his very first scientific achievement, announced here. Do note also the strikings out at the bottom of the page. That's because on the same evening, William Brown, a well-known radical, expounded ideas on the fact that the spirit and the mind were simply products of the physical brain. That was deemed too heretical, and various members insisted that it be struck from the record of the Plinian Society. It had never been said. But I'm sure John Henry will be able to pick up. This is part of the atmosphere that was around in Edinburgh at that time. Well, anyway, there he was in Diggs in 11 Lothian Street, now the back of on the site of the Museum Lecture Theatre. And a few years ago, we had great delight in unveiling a very beautiful plaque. If you've not seen it, do go and have a look at it. It shows up particularly well on a sunny morning walking up South College Street, because the bronze catches the light very nicely. And it commemorates Charles Darwin almost exactly on that site. He was in Diggs with Mrs. Mackay and with his brother. That's Sarah Boyack, the local MSP. This was a very nice event which united the town, the city, the university and the museum. So anyway, as the principal has already told you, we've got three distinguished speakers tonight to speak about elements of Darwin's thinking and his interests when he was here, and what kind of environment, scientific and social, he would have found himself in. So first I'll ask Professor Stuart Munro, who is a geologist and scientific director of the Dynamic Earth, to talk about Darwin's geological interests.
Okay, thanks. Okay, what I wanted to do tonight was to explore Darwin in a geological context. And as I was putting this together, it became really obvious that Darwin, along with many other generations of scientists, was actually standing on the shoulders of the predecessors, standing on the shoulders of giants. And I just want to draw to your attention some of the things that went on prior to Darwin that actually influenced his thinking, but also some of the fallout thereafter. Now, I think if you consider natural selection, if you consider the whole process of evolution, there is one thing that you actually need. You need time. Time is what you need. And the first guy to actually embrace this whole concept and trying to quantify what time was all about was this man, Archbishop Usher of Armagh, who went back to what he thought was the most reliable source of data, namely the Bible. And he looked at the successive generations and worked out just when the earth had been formed. And he came up with the conclusion that the earth was formed on the evening prior to the 23rd of October in the year 4004 BC. 6,000 years. Not an awful lot of time to actually evolve the myriad of species that Darwin was actually looking at. But then somebody else came along with a strong Edinburgh connection. A man who had his house just in behind the Dunby Dykes flats down the road, within spitting distance of Dynamic Earth, James Hutton, the father of modern geology, again someone who came to Edinburgh to study medicine and couldn't quite take it and went off to do other things elsewhere. But he was a man who actually really set the hair running with regard to this concept of what he called deep time. He was a polymath as well. Like Darwin, he was interested in all aspects of things. And it's that integration that I think is one of the driving forces in producing new ideas. He went to a place called Sicker Point, the most important geological locality in the world, just south of Dunbar. I hope you've all been there. No? Oh dear. Here it is. And what do you see there? Well, we see rocks that are standing up vertically. And on top of them, we've got rocks that are just dipping gently off towards the sea. And Hutton asked the most important question that any scientist can ask, which is, so what? What does this mean? And the conclusion that he came to is, if you're going to get those rocks vertical, they would have originally been horizontal, deposited horizontally. You need to squeeze them, push material up, push material down, fold them all up. In other words, that you produce mountains. But on top of that, we've got these low dipping rocks on top. And if they're going to be deposited, you need to erode those mountains away. The question he asked Playfair and Sir James Hall, how long does it take to build a mountain? How long does it take to erode it away? Well, perhaps just a little bit longer than the 6,000 years that Archbishop Usher was talking about. And of course, that whole hare that had been started running actually ended up back here in Edinburgh again with Arthur Holmes, who actually recognised that we could actually date rocks accurately using radioactive decay, and came to the conclusion that we had the age of the Earth is something around about 4,500 million years, as we know today. And in 4,500 million years, you can do a lot. And that really is the background to a lot of the things that we're thinking about, because out of that spawned our new concept of plate tectonics, a thing that has just evolved during effectively my lifetime, but something that has been the spin-off of a lot of the thinking of Darwin as well, past, present, and indeed perhaps in the future as well. Jameson was a Neptunist. He believed that rocks were crystallized out of some primeval ocean, and Darwin went along to his lectures. He was bored stiff by his lectures, but he went along anyway. And that was the first introduction to the science of geology that Darwin had. But Hutton was a Plutonist. He believed that volcanic processes were important. But of course, unfortunately, Hutton was the most appalling communicator. My advice to you is, if you're ever suffering from insomnia, read some of the original works of Hutton. It's just impossible to read. So how did Darwin actually get hold of these ideas that were so fundamental to actually developing his evolutionary thinking? And this man, Lyell, was the man who can do it, the great communicator, the man who was able to take a lot of the Hutton ideas and in his principles of geology, communicate them in a way that Hutton could actually use. And funnily enough, Lyell's book, The Principles of Geology, Hutton actually had on his journey in the Beagle. That journey was one to map the coastline of the southern part of South America. But it was also a journey where they wanted to actually look at the tropical islands, the coral islands, and look at this hypothesis that they might have a volcanic origin. So things are beginning to come together. The volcanism, the interest in volcanism, the things that we have in terms of the voyage of the Beagle that are really quite important in developing the Hutton idea, the ideas that Charles Darwin had. And of course, the story does go full cycle, because we now know that the Wallace line, Wallace was also looking at the possibilities of evolution as one of a primary driving force within the world, that Wallace line is defined by a plate boundary, where things have actually moved physically, and therefore on either side of it, different organisms has actually evolved. So the story goes full circle, and the story has a small but important foundation within this city of Edinburgh that we all know. And perhaps the lesson that we take out of that, the lesson of the foundations on which Darwin's work was created, is that one needs to look holistically. One needs to look at the interactions between all different parts of the world in which we live. We need to engage closely in what we now call Earth system science. No longer can we remain within silos. That's something for the future. And it's nice to know that the work of Darwin 200 years ago is really very relevant today and is actually blossoming in new ideas for the future. So, just points that I might like to put into your mind just now. What's the role of the polymath? Very evident during the Enlightenment. What relevance does that have now? What's the importance of Darwin's concepts of evolution, of new ideas that are developing? How did Darwinian ideas contribute to modern scientific thinking? Because the great thing is now we are standing on the shoulders of another giant, and that giant was Darwin himself. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Stuart. That was, there's some excellent points there, and I hope we'll have a chance to pick them up later. I'll ask John Henry now to talk to us about the scientific background into which the young Darwin came. He's a reader in the Science Studies unit and an expert on actually the earlier centuries, but you're moving into the 19th century for this purpose. John Henry.
Well, thank you, Aubrey, and thanks to Stuart for that very wide-ranging survey of geology past and present. I'm going to bring the focus right down and just talk about Darwin and Edinburgh. It's usually said that Darwin's voyage on the Beagle, and in particular his visit to the Galapagos Islands, were the most important factors in his development as a scientist. But I want to suggest that Darwin's stay in Edinburgh from 1825 to 27 should rank alongside the Galapagos Islands as providing an equally unique and important background which shaped Darwin as the founder of modern biology. So he could have stayed here. But before doing that, I just want to make sure that you are all aware that Darwin was not the discoverer of the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution already had a long but fairly disreputable history before Darwin came into the picture. What Darwin was to do was to provide an explanatory principle which showed how evolution could take place, and in so doing to make the theory of evolution scientifically respectable for the first time. Darwin's great contribution, therefore, was not the theory of evolution itself, but the principle of natural selection, which indicated how evolution happened. Now, the theory of evolution had developed before Darwin as an attempt to explain the major problem, which was always referred to as the origin of species, which, of course, Darwin later used as the title of his book. Sir John Herschel, one of the leading scientists in 19th century Britain, had referred to this problem as the mystery of mysteries. This problem, this great mystery, emerged as a result of the work of geologists and the increasing discovery of fossils. It became apparent from this work that, contrary to the Bible, all the creatures in the world were not created at the same time. The fossil record made it apparent that the Earth was first populated only by what were regarded as primitive forms of life, and the more advanced forms of life appeared successively over many ages. So, as Adam Sedgwick said, there was a time when cephalopoda were the highest types of animal life. They were then the primates of the world. Fishes next took the lead. Following our history chronologically, reptiles next took the lead at the head of nature, not by transmutation, so that's not by evolution, but by creative addition, and they flourished as lords and despots of the world. Mammals were added next and seem to have been added suddenly. So this immediately gave rise to the problem as to how the later, more advanced species originated. It seemed clear that new animals and plants are created from time to time. Now, I must offer a word of caution here, because many books in the history of science suggest that most thinkers before Darwin believed in special creation. That is, that God simply created the new life forms at the appropriate moment in the history of the Earth. But this is very unfair to 19th century scientists. It's possible that there were some religious believers who thought this way, but for the most part, scientists were agreed that to call upon God to solve the problem was to abandon the scientific enterprise. And we can see that in the quote from Whewell. For most scientists, the scientific solution to the mystery of the origin of species had to refer only to laws of nature and natural phenomena. And it was also generally agreed that those laws should be couched in terms of biological adaptation and environmental determinism. The trouble was that the only explanation of the origin of species which fulfilled these two requirements was the theory of evolution, and very few were willing to accept the truth of this theory. Biologists wanted an alternative theory, and in the meantime, they suspended judgment on the origin of species, even to the point of refusing to engage with this mystery of mysteries. The leading evolutionary theorist before Darwin was the French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, but his work was vigorously opposed on both scientific and religious grounds. Nevertheless, he did have a few scattered followers. In 1825, when Darwin came up to Edinburgh to study medicine, he was to be taught by two of Lamarck's followers. One of these, we've already heard about, was Professor Robert Jameson, who was born in Leith and became the Professor of Natural History. But Jameson was the only professor in any British university who took evolution seriously and who included it in his lectures. The other was Robert Grant. Grant did not teach at the university. That's Jameson. There's Grant. Grant did not teach at the university, but at one of the private schools which offered extramural classes to university medical students. Same school, in fact, that used to buy bodies off Burke and Hare. Darwin mentioned Grant in his autobiography. I knew him well. He one day, when we were walking together, burst forth in high admiration of Lamarck and his views on evolution. I listened in silent astonishment, and as far as I can judge, without any effect on my mind. I'm afraid Darwin was being very, very unfair to Grant here. This was written 2 years after Grant's death, and long after he and Darwin had had a falling out. It's easy to see from the historical record, however, that Grant actually had a very profound influence on the young Darwin. Grant took Darwin under his wing, and over a period of about 5 months, they spent many hours together. They used to walk to New Haven, to Leith, or to Portobello together, where they would collect specimens of various marine invertebrates, and frequently they would return to Grant's home on the shore at Preston Pans to examine them. Grant taught Darwin how to use a microscope and how to dissect specimens in water. In showing Darwin what to look for, he was almost certainly emphasizing those things that a Lamarckian evolutionist would look for. Grant was also a great admirer of the evolutionary theorist who was known as the English Lamarck, and who was none other than Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. Of course, Charles was aware of his grandfather's work before he met Grant, but it was only after he met Grant that he began to study his work carefully. Lamarck and Grant were both specialists in marine invertebrates and used these creatures as a source of evidence for the truth of evolution. The same is perfectly true of Darwin, who spent many years studying barnacles in order to find extra support for natural selection and his own version of evolution. Indeed, as a leading Darwin expert has said, Grant gave Darwin the early understanding of developmental studies among invertebrates that eventually formed the cornerstone of his evolutionary theories. So when Darwin was in Edinburgh, he found himself in a unique place for evolutionary studies. If there was anywhere in Britain where Darwin might have been persuaded to take evolutionary ideas seriously, it was Edinburgh, and nowhere else. When Darwin converted to a belief in evolution in 1837, he was returning to what he'd already learned in Edinburgh. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, John. That gives, I think, a suitable laudatory nod towards this city. It was, of course, at that time, just after the Great Enlightenment, and as an English immigrant, I'm always amazed to think of what huge influences this tiny country had at that time. And this leads neatly to Dr. Stannah Ditch, who is a social and economic historian, an expert on the Enlightenment, and well placed to give us an idea of the social setting into which that 15, 16-year-old came. Dr. Ditch.
Thank you. Well, I am going to talk a little bit about what Edinburgh was like when Darwin was a student here. And I'm going to illustrate this with a series of images from a publication of 1829, which is Modern Athens, illustrated by Thomas Shepherd. And this was published in London. It was published in conjunction with a series of similar images of other great cities, including London and the city of Bath. And it exemplifies the degree to which Edinburgh in the 1820s had become a fashionable European city of note. And this is the city to which young Darwin came. Now, when Darwin arrived in Edinburgh with his brother, they took rooms at the Star Hotel in Princes Street whilst they looked for lodgings, and they would have seen from their rooms probably a view like this of the old town. And they would have seen immediately that Edinburgh was a city of great contrasts. There was astonishing engineering, and Darwin did remark in a letter to his family how impressed he was by what he called Bridge Street and the bridges, which are remarkable engineering feats. But he would also have seen poverty, in this case rather picturesque poverty, down in St. Mary's Wynd, but nevertheless he would have noted that Edinburgh was a city of contrasts. There was a dark underbelly to the city, and this, of course, was the age of Burke and Hare. He lived a fashionable existence. He came from a wealthy family background. He was very convivial. It is commonly said he didn't enjoy his time at Edinburgh, but his letters suggest quite otherwise. He had a distinguished family with connections with Edinburgh, and he had introductions to elite social circles that were dominated by the great professions, the law, medicine, church, and of course the university. So his life as a student in Edinburgh was really not like the life of many students at Edinburgh. It was rather more privileged than was the norm. And in his letters home, he described going to the assembly, and he described going to the theatre, and he was a great lover of the theatre in his early youth, and he loved music, though he later lost interest in these subjects. And these, of course, were flourishing in Edinburgh at this time. This was a high point of theatre in Edinburgh. And his life was a long way from this dark underbelly, nicely represented by the Cowgate. And it was very much, of course, focused around the life of the university. Now, at the university, he was perhaps a dilatory student, though as a teacher of students at the University of Edinburgh, I do think that he sets a nice example of the fact that some of our less than engaged students can go on to very distinguished careers thereafter, so one mustn't dismiss people out of hand. But nevertheless, he was very involved in student life, student societies, and some mention has been made of his relationship with academic staff, with people associated with the museum at Edinburgh University, and these were his friends. And of course his life as a student at the university and also at the hospital, because some of his medical training was conducted at the hospital, brought him into contact with a range of people of a variety of social backgrounds. It is famously known, for instance, that one of his friends was a black former slave who was one of the taxidermists associated with the university museum, and he was taught taxidermy by this individual called Edmondson. Darwin was a great reader, and in fact the records of his library borrowing does in fact still survive, and he borrowed a lot of books. So one suspects the story of him as a not terribly engaged student is perhaps not entirely true. But he also enjoyed novel reading, and in fact reading novels was something he did a great deal, both whilst he was a student. He describes in letters to his sister how he stayed in bed reading Walter Scott rather than going to his lectures. And he continued throughout his life to be a great novel reader. But within Edinburgh at this time, in the late Enlightenment, and of course this is the period of the late Enlightenment, there was an astonishing atmosphere of intellectual and creative vibrancy. The 1820s, generally speaking, can be seen as an age not dissimilar to the 1920s or indeed to the 1960s. Very, very exciting to be young at this time. And for similar reasons to the 1920s and 1960s, a great war was now past, and a kind of more golden age had begun. And the legacy of the Napoleonic Wars, which had finished in 1815, really would only be superseded by the time you got to the 1820s. And created in the 1820s, and of course Edinburgh is a city that is full of beautiful, amazing buildings from this late Enlightenment period. There was this institution, this building, the so-called Royal Institution, which is today called the Royal Scottish Academy. And in conjunction with the university, and the university building is, of course, a building largely of the early 1820s. This was largely open for business in 1825. Here you had a variety of intellectual, social, cultural activity taking place. The Royal Society of Edinburgh met in this building, and Darwin saw Walter Scott at the Royal Society. The exhibitions of paintings and drawings, such as the Audubon birds, took place in this building. And in his later life, Darwin remarked on some of these events when he wrote his autobiography. And he said how proud he was to have been elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. That really was important for him, even though in later life he had relatively few connections with Edinburgh. And in Edinburgh in the 1820s, as in Britain as a whole in the 1820s, there are certain intellectual and creative undercurrents which must have had an impact on the young Charles Darwin. It was a time of great religious debate and pluralism, as the authority of the established church was diluted by the evangelical movement, was diluted by new Christian churches and new sects, and by deism and romantic pantheism, by atheism and, of course, apathy. And you can see this in Edinburgh. There's a vast surge of new church building. Go to the east end of the new town, walk down Broughton Street, and you'll see successions of churches from the 1820s reflecting this kind of new kind of intellectual debate about religion. And young men like Darwin, young middle-class men like Darwin, away from home in cities like Edinburgh, big cities where there's a lot going on, where there's debate and choice, they engage in a kind of pick and mix approach to religion. They go here, they go there. They think about it in different ways to what they might have done had they stayed at home in rather conventional expectations. And this may indeed have influenced in certain ways the genesis of some aspects of Darwin's thinking. But there's another thing that was going on in the mid-1820s, and this is the final observation that I would wish to make. The years from 1825 to 1826 saw the first great international financial crisis. This was an age which saw an international economy emerging. And this first financial crisis began as a banking crisis in London, with many similarities to what we see today: poor regulation, monetary expansion, risky speculation. At this point, it was risky speculation in South American mining activity rather than North American subprime mortgages, but the effect was the same. A domino effect on the rest of the economy caused bankruptcy and ruin for many. And though this started in London, it had spread to Edinburgh by late 1825, 1826, and there were great victims in Edinburgh. So some of the giants fell. The publishing company of Constable & Co. came down, of course, in bankruptcy, and that brought with it Walter Scott and the tragedy of the career of Walter Scott and the unexpected turns in the career of Walter Scott and the evolution of the economy in general and the processes of economic selection. And Darwin was aware of this because he wrote about some aspects of this to his sister. This demonstrated in some ways the survival of the fittest, and it may well have afforded Charles Darwin parallels with the natural world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stannah. Thank you to all these three for having given us a pretty clear picture, I think, of what the young Darwin met when he came here. The idea is that we're going to bat the ball to and fro between us for a few minutes and then try to involve you as well. And just to kick the ball into play, you've all of you given a very vivid picture of Edinburgh, a big city with a lot going on. I mean, a major place of thinking, of economics, of contrasts. What do you think the young Darwin, who went from here via various side trips to Cambridge, to the small, pure academic city, dominated by theology? You couldn't be a fellow of a college unless you were in holy orders. What do you think he made of that? That's also a contrast, isn't it?
I think it must have been a bit of a culture shock, you know, because I mean, Edinburgh at that time was a geographically small place, but big in terms of the numbers that were there. So everybody was cramped into a fairly small, tight bunch of houses, and instead of spreading out laterally, we spread upwards. You know, we have these wonderful tenements that we have in Edinburgh, but everybody was living cheek by jowl with each other. And this is part of what I think is the way in which this polymath attitude was actually fostered. The fact that, you know, people, you know, if you stand in the high street, I can shake the hand of 12 men of genius any day. You know, that was what Edinburgh was like. And I mean, to have a city like that, and then to go from it out to Cambridge. Well, I think it's quite a good foundation if you're actually going to change that environment. And I think to have that foundation before you actually go to a rather more academic area like Cambridge would have been quite advantageous for him. I don't know what the rest of you think.
I think the other thing to bear in mind is that while he was here, Darwin was, of course, training originally for medicine. I mean, that was the idea. He was going to make a career in medicine, but of course he fairly rapidly gave that up. I mean, he didn't like the sight of blood and you know, various other things he found very uncongenial about medicine. But when he moved to Cambridge, he was going to train for the Anglican ministry.
Yes, of course.
And he was resigned to that. He was going to be a country parson. I mean, he actually almost, you know, in some of his letters, it sounds as though he was almost looking forward to the life of a country parson, you know, when he could get on with his interest in natural history, you know, without much interference.
I think he would have found Cambridge socially more congenial. He was, after all, a wealthy English gentleman brought up in a sort of Anglican Unitarian tradition. I think he would have found the more democratic elements of Edinburgh intellectual life interesting, but perhaps a little bit challenging. I mean, he obviously enjoyed the theatre and all that, you know, and there's a lot of that, probably a great deal more of that in Edinburgh than there was in Cambridge. But he took to the social milieu of Cambridge, and he was very involved in sort of gentlemanly sporting activity and shooting, and he had this idea of himself as a sort of country clergyman with a private income, doing a little bit of sort of light clerical duty, but doing his other things on the side, and that is probably more a Cambridge thing than an Edinburgh thing.
Yes, it's interesting to speculate that he jolly nearly did drift into that country parson being an amateur naturalist tradition, which is, I may say, is an honourable tradition in the British Isles. But luckily he followed up a bit on Robert Grant, and he met up with Henslow, a very distinguished botanist, and obviously a very nice man too in Cambridge. And then old Sedgwick got hold of him because he went to Christ's College in Cambridge, and that was Sedgwick's college, and that picked up into his geological interests. So these two Cambridge characters really got him along more academic lines, didn't they?
And Sedgwick was a character who actually did an awful lot of field work. And, you know, there's field work in geology, there's field work in biology as well, but they are connected. They're using the important tool that a scientist has got, which is these two things either side of our nose. We're great observers. And to be able to be taken out by Sedgwick, taken out into the field, across to Wales, to wander over the fields, to look at the rocks, to observe, and then to ask the question, so what? To try and explore what the mysteries were that were embedded within these rocks, I think is a skill which he obviously took to his very, very precise observations that he made when he actually went on the Beagle and then got to Galapagos.
Yes.
I mean, Henslow and Sedgwick were, of course, vigorously anti-evolutionary,
Yes,
and so
certainly.
that would be another dramatic difference between, his life in Edinburgh and his life in Cambridge. That, evolution was probably never mentioned in Cambridge. It was a dirty word.
Well, it was it was an extraordinary fact that he very nearly didn't go on the Beagle either, did he? I mean, his parents didn't want him to go there. Presumably, they were desperate for him to get a career. They wanted to know, they had plenty of money, but they wanted him to take up a career, and the church seemed to be the thing. And then it was one of his uncles, wasn't it, Wedgwood, who, of the great pottery, ceramics, just gone bankrupt. It's a really sad thing to think of that, but he persuaded Darwin's father to let him go. Yeah. And the rest is really history, I think.
Yes,
Do any of you want to challenge each other?
It is actually interesting, this business of allowing the son to go, because we are talking about a journey that could have very easily ended in death. I mean, many, many young men got on boats and went on great journeys and did not come back. So it is interesting that a sort of very risky undertaking was agreed to, because neither of the brothers pursued, the two brothers, neither of them pursued careers to the despair of what appears to have been an enormously energetic and a very, very successful father, medic. And the other brother had rather poor health. But it is amazing to me in the context that a son, a young man, would be allowed to go on that kind of journey. Because he wasn't, he wasn't in the Navy. He was a sort of gentleman companion.
Yes.
But doing a job of work. The challenge of that whole expedition was to go out there and map the southern coast of South America. Yes. Why? So that it could actually help the commercial activity that was going on from this country.
But he was still the gentleman companion rather than the one doing the job of work, as it were.
Yes, but it was all like that in those days. Jobs of work were done that way.
They were not, I'm afraid.
Fundamentally, that was what was about.
But I'm sure you're right, son. I mean, Fitzroy wanted a gentleman companion, because otherwise he would have to sit in the officer's cabin on his own. There were no other gentlemen on the boat. And so he was, I think Fitzroy referred to him as his Philos, and many of the discussions they had, it's a really tantalizing thing to think that the table from the Beagle was until quite recently known still to exist. It had been taken off the Beagle when the Beagle was converted into a prison hulk later in the 19th century. And the table moved around between various owners. Does anybody know where that table is? It is worth rescuing, if so. I think it's time to try to involve you, because you've been sitting very patiently. We have the usual roving mics. And can I ask you, if you would like to ask a question, please be as brief as possible, and we'll try to get some discussion going. So who would like to kick off? Gentleman in the front row.
I mean, was it because of the medical reputation? Was it because of the
The question was, why did Darwin's family decide to send him to the Edinburgh to get his medical degree? I don't know where his father had qualified. All I can say is I do know that the Edinburgh Medical School had a very high reputation at that time. Is that not so, John?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it was coming down, it has to be said. It was coming down from a height, but it was such a high height that even though it was coming down, it was still pretty high. But Erasmus Darwin, his grandfather, had trained here in medicine in Edinburgh, and his father, Robert, had trained here in Edinburgh. So. And it was the medical school to go to at that time. It had taken over from Leiden in the Netherlands as the best place in the world, really, to study medicine.
Yes. I know a lot of Americans came over at that time, too. So
you had the advantage that there were no religious tests here in Edinburgh. If you wanted to go to Oxford or Cambridge, you had to swear an oath to uphold the 39 Articles of the Anglican Church, which, of course, in Edinburgh wasn't required. So if you're a dissenter, you know, Quaker or whatever,
And
you could come.
it was the largest group of students, the medical students, so it was far larger than any other category of student at that time. So I think, and plus the fact it's a very congenial city, and his family had letters of introduction because of their connections to what you would call high society.
Yes, yes. Please. Gentleman here.
As I was coming into the building tonight, I was handed a pamphlet by people outside saying evolution is science, but Christianity is religion. Now, I don't know if any of the people handing out the leaflet had come in, but there's a very interesting question about Darwin and religion, because he was married to a Unitarian. And yet, Darwin, in the end of the day, was very critical of Christianity. And in his autobiography, which wasn't published till he was dead, certain passages criticizing Christianity as a monstrous religion because of the consigning of believers to heaven and non-believers to hell. He thought that was monstrous. That was only published later because it was considered that the original version was too critical of Christianity to be allowed to be published. The second interesting thing is that, of course, Darwin came to Edinburgh at a time not long after the Radical Rising in Scotland in 1820. And the Radical Road, which might have been pointed out round Arthur's Seat, was formed by a chain gang of radicals. These were radicals, people seeking democracy in the country. So, and of course, after that, the Chartist movement came along, which Darwin must have known about. I would be interested to know if any of your speakers have something to say about Darwin's connections with A, religion, and B, politics.
Well, thank you, sir. We'll kick Stannah.
Thank you very much. Well, I was indeed thinking as I came. I'm not an expert on 19th century religious history, but I do know that although we look at Darwin in the context of a sort of growing atheism, if you like, and then a criticism of traditional Christian practice, it has to be seen in the context of a much more general questioning of certain traditions. And of course, by the time you get into the second half of the 19th century, what is really a very considerable popular crisis of faith. So there are all sorts of anxieties about church going, about the established church, and about Christianity, which are reflected in events like the 1851 religious census by the government, an attempt to see who actually goes to church on Sunday. So Darwin has to be put in a broader context. What he was thinking and articulating is famous, but it is no more than many others would have thought at the same time. It's just that they didn't have the opportunity to write it down or to be famous for it. When it comes to politics, I mean, it is the case that Darwin's, although he came from quite a famous Whig family, he does not appear to have been much of a Democrat, really, and he appears to have rather dim views about later developments like socialism, for instance. And he probably would not have had much truck with the Chartists. So I think he, in many ways, was quite conservative with a small c, about his politics.
Mm. It's very interesting that on Darwin and politics, because his great scientific colleague and I think some considerable personal friend, Alfred Russel Wallace, was indeed a real socialist. He was much influenced by Owen at New Lanark and in fact wrote books on social development and distribution of wealth. Now, I think Darwin did shy away from any sort of active involvement there, didn't he? Darwin's attitude towards not just Christianity, but really the whole idea of a supreme being, quite mysterious, really. I mean, something went out of Darwin when his beloved daughter Annie died at the age of about 11, I think it's recorded that he never ever went to church again after that, whereas he'd gone with Emma, who was a fairly regular churchgoer. I think it's quite mysterious.
Though he did, I think he slightly flirted with spiritualism at one point. Am I right?
Well, Wallace did. I'm not sure
Wallace
that Darwin did.
Because, I mean, spiritualism is enormously fashionable in intellectual
Yes.
circles, and this is part of the crisis of faith. I think he may have flirted, but said, no, it's nonsense.
Yeah.
So he tried other things.
Yes.
Sorry.
I'm just going to say that, I mean, Darwin became an evolutionist in 1837. He came up with the idea for natural selection in 1838, and he became an atheist in 1851. So it is possible to be an evolutionist and to still believe in God and just believe that evolution is the means by which God, enacts the origin of species. And that was certainly the way Darwin thought, for many years when he first came up with the theory. But,
When you say he became an atheist, did he say, write down, I was an
Yes, I
atheist?
wonder why he said that.
effectively, he was. His faith was already, in crisis. I mean, he was, turning, as the, questioner suggested, he was turning against the church already because some of the doctrines he found unacceptable. But as Aubrey says, it was the death of his beloved daughter, his favourite daughter. I think she was 10 years old and died of tuberculosis, and it was very distressing for the whole family, but Darwin never really got over it. And after that, I think he effectively, washed his hands of religion.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, there's someone in the balcony up there. Can we get any kind of amplification for you, sir? Mike, coming.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Recently I read an article that discussed how, in a sense, Darwin is maybe too big, because by taking evolution and making it Darwinism, it's harmful for the adoption of evolution as a theory. Because, in a sense, Darwin only has a small facet of evolution. He doesn't mention Mendelian genetics. He doesn't cover genetic drift. And there's quite a bit of evolution that we know about now that Darwin does not cover. He just covers natural selection. And I'm wondering what your thought is on that, because the fear is that by making it Darwinism, by focusing on what is one facet of evolution, it's easy to attack.
Okay, I think we all got that. Thank you, sir. Anybody like to comment on that? John?
It's your department.
I think I would say that you're being a bit hard on Darwin. John described how the great problems which the origin of species caused to science, with few scientists accepting ideas of special creation, but then how could you change one to another? And I think we mustn't underestimate the way that Darwin and Wallace provided a mechanism which made some good sense. Of course, you're right, he had little idea, and indeed some quite incorrect and crazy ideas about the inheritance of characters. Mendel was working at the same sort of time, or a bit later, but there's no evidence that Darwin ever read Mendel's work, which is rather tantalizing in a way. But I think, okay, you're right. I take your point that we're tending to put the whole thing onto Darwin. He wouldn't have wished that, I'm sure. But as Stuart said, people do science progresses by standing on the shoulders of giants. And Darwin's great contribution to human thinking was to come up with a well-worked out and, above all, a well-evidenced theory. I mean, do read, if you've not done, dip into The Origin of Species. I happen to like Victorian prose, so it's easy for me. But his description of his experiments, his description of his observations are really quite excellent. I mean, they really are hammering home the point. The very first chapter, Variation Under Domestication, that's where it really started. Darwin, carrying on his country pursuits, was a great pigeon fancier. And some of his early illustrations come from that. But I take your point, we mustn't, of course, the whole study of evolution has progressed enormously since. In fact, we're going to do a little bit of a book launch at the end of this meeting, which shows just evolution today. So, madam, anyway.
On the origin of species, Darwin does a little bit of history of science as well. And he certainly paints himself as the only person up to that point who has imagined that all species came from, possibly from just one original, or he says one or a small number. Mm-hmm. And in the second to the last chapter, he paints himself as the first person to argue that systematics, the relationships between all the biological classes, can only be explained in terms of this of common descent. And he says it's the only thing, and he demonstrates it's the only thing that explains morphological parallelisms, homology. It's the only thing that explains common facts about embryology of organisms from widely differing typological classes. It's the only thing that explains vestigial and rudimentary organs in living species. So he certainly paints himself not just as the person who discovered descent with modification, but the first person who looked at the entire biological creation as having descended systematically from, as he says, one or a small number of organisms. Okay. Is that not correct?
I'll leave it to the panel.
I mean, I think, he has a point, but I don't know, I've never gotten to the bottom of why Darwin says this, except that in Lamarckian evolution, Lamarck believes in spontaneous generation. And so, Lamarck believes that, slime or, some sort of gelatinous matter can spontaneously become living matter. And then you're on the escalator of nature, as it were, and life forms progress and get, higher up the escalator, as it were. And if you believe that, then, of course, you can have spontaneous generation occurring in lots of places at once, and so the whole thing is there's a whole army of, escalators or creatures rising up the chain of life, as it were. And Darwin never discusses spontaneous generation, so I suppose he therefore talks about there just being one beginning from which everything else comes. But I don't know why he doesn't discuss spontaneous generation, because it was controversial, but there were plenty of scientists who did accept it. Huxley believed in spontaneous generation, for example.
Did he?
Yeah.
But this was a question about Darwin as an individualist, isn't it? And that's what I understand this question to be about, whether Darwin does acknowledge the other giants in the particular universe. And there is a lot of work on the psychology of Darwin and his self-fashioning through his autobiographical writing and indeed through his prodigious letter writing and this amazing correspondence he creates. And he did do what was very commonly done in the 19th century. He created a heroic personal identity as an individual forging an independent path, which is quite unlike an 18th century personality would have invented themselves out. So I think there's an interesting moment in time to do with the way in which Darwin invents himself as the originator of some of these ideas.
Yes.
And if I can put this into a 21st century context, because I think for the young folk in the audience tonight, I think that's important. This is an area that we still haven't resolved. I mean, as scientists, we're very good at telling you what we know. We are much poorer at actually telling you what we don't know. And there's a whole lot that we don't know. And the amount of science that's going on just now to look at how life can actually kick off. There's exploratory work going on in Titan, looking at the environment within Titan, to see whether that was an analogous situation to what the early Earth was like.
That's the moon of Saturn, is that
That's right, yes. All of these things are really exciting things that are there, which are actually building on the fundamental ideas that Darwin had. So to the young folk here, I say, come on, You know, remember the giants that have been in the past, but you're the giants that might be there in the future. There's a whole lot still to be done. And this is a really exciting time to be involved in science, and particularly the science of biology.
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think you make a good point, sir, because it's clear from some of his correspondence that Darwin was not lacking in self-confidence about his ideas, certainly. And he needed to be. I mean, he realized he was going to be attacked, and he always tried to head off attacks in advance, as far as I can see. I mean, one of the strong points of The Origin of Species is that he has a chapter, I think it's 6, entitled Objections to the Theory. And that was a powerful weapon in his armory. Of course, it probably also accounts for the absolute bombshell that hit him when Wallace's letter arrived from the Far East. And a great, I think, a collapse of his confidence, which was bolstered up by Huxley and Henslow and Hooker and so on. Time for perhaps one more question. Anybody like to go, or we'll try and... Gentleman over there.
Wallace, and one of the gentlemen there says that Darwin discovered natural selection in 1838. If he discovered it in 1838, I take it you all agree it was profound. It stands itself without even evidence. I mean, it's click, of course. Why didn't he publish or release it in the paper? And why did he wait till 1859, The Origin of Species, to mention natural selection?
Yeah, that is that's a question that people are debating still. One of the conventional answers up to now has been that he was very worried about the response, which ideas of evolution, he was thinking, of course, particularly of the fact that everybody would recognize he was talking about the evolution of human beings as well, that this idea would cause such furore that he backed away from it. Coupled with that, his diffidence towards his deeply religious wife, Emma. There are others who argue that no, he was being very systematic. He wanted to pile evidence, Pelion upon Ossa, before he ventured into print. There are others who think he was just too damn busy doing other things. He was writing a monograph on barnacles, which he often refers to in his text as the barnacles will overwhelm me, and so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, his textbook on barnacles is still the recognized work. Nobody's done anything since. There are all those ideas. Yeah. But it still remains something of a mystery, I think. I'm sure you have 3 different opinions.
I mean, there is an Edinburgh connection here. He wrote a draft, or a sort of essay, he called it an essay, which was a 250-page summary of his theory. And he was contemplating publishing this in 1844. And then Robert Chambers of the Chambers Publishing Company here in Edinburgh anonymously published a book called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, which is a work of evolutionary theory. And it really did cause a huge sort of bombshell. And it caused, Darwin to go on the back foot, and he decided then, and in fact that's when he turned to the barnacles. He decided that he needed to be an expert in a particular area, because everybody criticized the author of the Vestiges. They didn't know who it was, but they said, whoever this is, he's an amateur. He doesn't know any real science. He just picks up bits here and there from textbooks, and he hasn't done any real science. And in a way, that's what Darwin himself had done in this 250-page essay. He'd just sort of taken ideas from other scientists. And so he thought, rather than be a polymath, I'll be a specialist. And he spent 7 or 8 years working on barnacles.
barnacles.
And it
yes.
paid off if nobody's done anything since.
Well, I should qualify that nobody has done a systematic work on barnacles.
But there is another, as it were, more pedestrian explanation. I'm sure this is the principal explanation, and he was, of course, very busy with other writing projects. But he also suffered long periods of ill health, where he was away taking rest cures and various cures. So he had his working life was punctuated by extended periods of ill health where he couldn't write. And many of these projects had to be built around that kind of personal experience, coupled with having, I think, 10 or 12 children. I mean, there was an enormous family and enormous domestic and family responsibilities, plus waiting for the right time, and then finding that he'd almost missed the right time, that somebody else had got there ahead. So I think there were a balance of complex issues behind it.
Yes, you mentioned, I believe it was 11 children, 10 of whom, well, one I think died very early in birth and others later. But I mean, Emma Darwin is a good subject for biographical attention too, because she was clearly a remarkable woman. And I believe she was fluent in reading German, which he wasn't. And a lot of the literature at that time was in German. So Emma was also taking part in the scientific enterprise. It was a very remarkable marriage, really. I think the relationship between Wallace and Darwin is an extremely interesting one. Wallace was a very great naturalist and also a huge admirer of Darwin. I was thinking when you were speaking, sir, that at the time, Darwin and his collaborators, Henslow and Hooker and Huxley, were worried that Wallace would be greatly offended that the idea was to publish jointly a paper to the Linnean Society proceedings in 1858. And the worry was that it was completely impossible to communicate this to Wallace, who was in the Far East. But far from it, when Wallace learnt that this was being done, he was a bit worried that he couldn't correct his own proofs before this paper went into print. But he was absolutely delighted to be associated with Darwin. And of course, a few years later, he wrote an account of evolution, which he called Darwinism. I don't believe he was the first person to use that word, but he certainly was an early person to use that word. And I think that it's a remarkable tribute to Wallace. I can't resist telling you, many of you, for those of you who will know it, forgive me, the joint paper in 1858, July the 1st, 1858, was by Mr. Darwin and Mr. Wallace on the tendency of species to vary, etc., etc. And it was read at the meeting of the Linnean Society, which at that time was, I forget what their buildings were then, they're now in Piccadilly, but anyway, it was a well-known London society. At the end of each year, the Linnean Society president has to recount, just go over a progress report of the year past. And at the end of 1858, the president, whose name has been forgotten, I mean, we could look it up, but I've certainly forgotten it, said that the society has met as usual regularly. It was a pity to have to say that no papers of particular significance had been read at the society. He is number one in the book of heroic failures. How could you be more wrong than that? But from there on it went, and Darwin and Wallace were in constant correspondence all for the rest of their lives. I'm looking at time, and we're not too badly off. If anybody is bursting to come in, we can have a question.
It was mentioned in two of the talks that both Darwin and Hutton before him were great polymaths. What's the panel's views on the likelihood of the current academic environment producing such wide-ranging knowledge?
It's very good because that's one of the points that Stuart had for discussion. So you can answer that, Stuart.
Yeah, I'm fairly firmly of the belief that we actually need to cultivate more polymaths within our universities these days, particularly in the areas of science. Because, you know, if we look at where the exciting developments are coming, they're not coming within the silos that are clearly labelled chemistry, physics, biology, or whatever, but they're occurring at the interfaces of disciplines, and often at the interface of a discipline between science and social science as well. And, you know, looking at perhaps the biggest challenge that's facing humanity just now, namely the challenge of climate change. To understand that, yes, well, we probably have got a fair way down the road in understanding it. But importantly, looking at how we can actually mitigate the effects and how we can actually overcome some of those things that are happening just now with the increased number of of greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere, will require people who are capable of thinking across the disciplines. And I think as I look around Edinburgh University at the present moment, I think that's a university which is cultivating this interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary approach that is really quite important for assuring that not just the survival of humanity, but the survival, well, the planet will keep going on, there's no doubt about that, but will it keep going on in the way that we've known it? It may be life, Jim, but it won't be life as we know it.
Polymaths, are they cultivable? Are they
I mean, you have to
detectable?
You have to say that there's an awful lot of specialisation nowadays, and that has to be combated, really, I think, for, you know, polymaths to really be able to stick their heads above the parapet again, as it were.
I know some polymaths in this university. I think things are not as bleak as perhaps we think.
And if you walk down Edinburgh Street, can you shake hands with one?
Yeah.
Well, I think polymaths, it's being more difficult to be so inclusive as it used to be. I mean, there's, you know, an awful lot more on. I'm reminded of Gary Larson's wonderful cartoons. He's a biologist cartoonist, you know, but the far side. And there is a class of children being taught, and one of them, who doesn't look to be intellectually very advanced, is putting his hand up. Please, sir, can we stop now? My head is full. And I think I understand that. I mean, one's head can very rapidly fill with aspects of the subject. I would like to, not altogether flippantly, to suggest that as well as trying to cultivate polymaths, we should also treasure heretics. I'm reminded how in geology and in biology I can think of very people who came up with ideas which were almost instantly dismissed as being ridiculous. Alfred Wegener,
yes.
Lynn Margulis in biology, who thought, and so on. What we should be looking for are where are today's heretics who will be tomorrow's establishment. People with wild ideas who are worth looking at. I've got a particular favorite in economics, but I won't bother you with him. But I mean, I think that's exactly it. And lastly, and again, not altogether flippantly, let us cultivate eccentrics. I think eccentrics have a lot to offer, because they're often thinking a bit tangentially. One more comment, and then I think we must begin to wind up. If you would wish, Madam.
I've been reflecting about the 16-year-old Darwin coming to Edinburgh and thinking how very young. I have a young son of my own. He's not quite at that stage yet, but he probably will be thinking about university at 16 because his birthday's February. And you think many 16-year-olds in Edinburgh might be thinking of university too. And just the remarkable thing about getting involved in university life in the Plinian society, how remarkable was that? I mean, was that a common thing for the time, or is it an unusual thing?
It is the age when, yes, it's the age when lads go to university in the 18th and 19th century. So he would have been surrounded by 16 and 17-year-olds. He wasn't running, well, he may have been running wild, but he wasn't actually. He was with an older brother. There were a lot of people keeping an eye on him. He was living in student lodgings in Lothian Street, where his landlady was feeding him and keeping an eye on him. And there's a great flow of family letters going back and forth telling him to buck his ideas up, and father's disappointed and all the rest of it. So I think this was not unusual at that point in time.
But it is a very interesting thought, isn't it? I mean, it still strikes us as very young. We think that at that age people have got a lot of learning to do, and he would have had less, straightforward formal education in the past than now. But so there he is. Anyway, I want to draw this part of the meeting to a close, and just quite briefly, before we go, we have a very interesting new addition. That is this opportunity to launch a book, which a number of the people from schools here have already received. This is the brainchild of Professor Mary Bounds, one of our vice principals, and it's about evolution today. It's so easy to think that evolution is over in the past. Not a bit of it. The principles of natural selection are operating everywhere, and they're not just operating in the biological kingdom as well. Mary, could I ask you to say a few words about this book?
Okay, well, this will be very brief, but what we wanted to do from the university was to have something that we could give to the next generation of biologists in schools, which would let them put Darwin's work in a current context. And so what we've produced is a booklet which goes very briefly through Darwin's history. It then talks about evolutionary theory now and involves all the advances in genetics, which Darwin didn't have the advantage of. It then looks through a series of things to try to see how Darwin affects everyday life and how his ideas will affect the future. So we have, for example, sections on climate change at the end. How is climate change going to affect the way evolution works? There are things in there about ever since the beginning, man has influenced the development of other species, ever since he started to deal with farm animals and crops. But now we can change genes and we can do a lot more. There is also things about medicine. You may think medicine doesn't sound very relevant to Darwin, but there are superbugs, and evolution has a big part to play there. So it's really a book that puts Darwin's ideas in a modern context. It's fairly closely linked to the 5th and 6th form curricula in biology, but it also has lots of social questions, lots of questions about ethics and should we do this, should we do that? And there's lots of possibilities for discussion and activities in the booklet. So those of you who are here tonight are lucky enough that you've been given a copy. Other copies will be sent around to the schools to help with your activities during Darwin year. And what I really want to do, the other thing is that I know it's not really intended for adults, but if adults want it, it can be got downloaded from the website. If you look at a website, just Google the University of Edinburgh and look for a site called SIBE, S-I-B-E, which is the Scottish Initiative for Biotechnology Education. You're entirely free to download the book, or as much or as little of it as you want. It's for anybody that wants it. And the other thing I want to do is just thank a few people who are here. This booklet is the work of a lot of people over 2 years, and it's there. What we wanted to do was, as well as telling people about Darwin's ideas and how they affect everyday life, is to show you what it's like to do modern research now. So there are lots of things in there reflecting the research that people are currently doing, and there's some interviews with people who are researchers, right from PhD students to professors. And we're seriously hoping that this will inspire some of you who are here and other people who are just going through their 5th and 6th year to become researchers and to become scientists. And I want to just finish by thanking all of those colleagues from the University of Edinburgh who gave up lots of their time, and also the SIBE team who've worked on this for 2 years. And I think particularly I'd like to thank Kathy Southwark, who is over there, who's has a teaching background and who's helped get the booklet ready on time and develop all the curriculum links. And as I said, the rest of the SIBE team who've done so much to help make sure that it was ready today for Darwin's birthday. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Well, Mary, thank you very much. And can I add personally my congratulations on it. It's a lovely book. I mean, it's lovely to handle, and it's beautifully illustrated, and it's full, as Mary was saying, of the excitement of science. And what I like about it is that you can see here science as part of culture. Science isn't different from the arts. It's a human activity like the arts. It's creative, it's fun. And this book does bring that out very much. Well, Principal, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to thank all the platform and to thank you all for coming. And I hope you'll applaud our excellent speakers, applaud a bit yourself, and as you're applauding, wish a happy 200th birthday to Charles Darwin.